Well, here we go for week 39 of our reading. And so this is the last week that we are in the Old Testament, and we are in the books of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now let's get a little bit of the setting for when these prophets did their work. Now when it comes to the prophets, we often put them in three categories, and there's some overlap here, but it's pretty helpful to think in terms of when the prophet did their work, either pre-exile, exile, or post-exile. And when it comes to our three prophets this week, they are post-exile prophets. Now what takes place is this. The people, as we've talked about before, in 586 BC, the Babylonian nation comes and they destroy the city of Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, and they take the people to Babylon. But as world events transpire, the Persian Empire becomes the dominant world power, and they let the people go back to Jerusalem. And so what happens is around 50,000 or so people decide to go back. And they go back and they lay the foundation of the temple, they set up the altar, but then they just leave it at that. And so for many years, almost 20 years, the temple just kind of lays in ruins. And we need to remember how vital and important the temple was to the worship of the Jewish people. And so what had happened is they began to build their own houses and kind of focus on their own personal things instead of finishing this work of completing the temple. And so we remember the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, how they were encouraged to build the wall and to build the temple. And so Haggai and Zechariah, they are speaking into this moment, and they are urging the people to complete this work. Now, when we move to the book of Malachi, we're not exactly sure when he did his prophetic work. We know he's a post-exile prophet, and he might have been around the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah. He might have been just a little bit later. But his message is this. As the people had returned to Jerusalem and building their homes and all these different things, they really had this half-hearted commitment to the Lord. They really had this apathy to the Lord. And so what Malachi is doing is really urging them to be fully committed to God. And I think this book really can apply to our own lives today. At times we have different seasons where maybe we're not fully committed. And so I would encourage you to kind of read it in that light, and I think it'll really apply to you today. Now when we get to chapters 3 and 4 of Malachi, this may sound very familiar because we read this at least part of this in the New Testament, where this coming messenger is to prepare the way for the Lord. And what this is speaking of is the work of John the Baptist, who is preparing the way for Jesus Christ. Now, when we read this, and I'm sure when the people heard this from Malachi, they got excited. For years, they've been anticipating and longing for the Messiah to come. And then Malachi, he again gives this prophecy, and they're probably thinking, oh, this is going to happen very soon, or maybe within a generation. But this is not the case. What happens is we enter into this, what is known as the 400 years of silence. I mean, think about that. 400 years, that is a very long time, where not one prophet of the Lord was sent to give the people a new word. Now, we may kind of hear that and get discouraged and think maybe the Lord wasn't working, but that is not the case. So though the Lord did not send a prophet for 400 years, he was working in some pretty significant ways. And so I want to kind of connect some of the dots as the Lord prepared for the coming of John the Baptist and then Jesus Christ. So let's go back to the vision of Daniel. Daniel's given this vision of these different world empires that are going to come. And so we see Babylon and then Persia, and this is taking place. Remember, Babylon has taken the people into exile, and then Persia allows them to go back. Then Greece becomes the dominant world power, and then Rome. I want to touch on a couple significant things when it came to the empire of Greece and then Rome. So when Greece takes over, the dominant language becomes Greek, and this even applied to the Jewish people. And it was in this time period that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, what we know as the Old Testament, was translated into Greek. This is called the Septuagint. And this is significant because this was translated into the language of the people. This would be like for us when the Bible went from Latin to English so that we could read it much easier. Okay? Then we get into the Empire of Rome. Now, when Rome takes over, one of the things that they wanted to establish is an empire that had peace. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody enjoyed the Roman Empire and that there were skirmishes and different fights that took place. But for the most part, the Roman Empire was very peaceful. The other thing that the Romans did was they built this road system throughout the nation, just thousands upon thousands of miles of roads. And this was for travel, this was for commerce. So what happens is this, and this is why it's significant in this 400-year silent period where we think maybe the Lord wasn't doing much, is that he was preparing the way for Jesus, but also for the work of the disciples. And so what happens is this. Jesus arrives on the scene. He is born in this Roman Empire. And he lives, he dies on the cross, he rises, and then he goes to heaven. And then he tasks his disciples with what? Spreading the gospel. And so what happened in this time period of Greece and then Rome is this. The Bible had been translated into the language of the people so they could understand it much easier. And then as the gospel went forth in this time of peace and with this road system, the gospel could spread much easier. I just find that fascinating, that for 400 years of what is known as the silent years, where the Lord did not send a prophet, he was still working to fulfill his promises and predictions. And this is a great word for us, that we may not always see the timing of the Lord. We may sometimes kind of disagree or get frustrated with the timing of the Lord in our own life, maybe the life of our church, but the Lord is working. And so that gives me confidence in my own life. I hope it gives you confidence in yours, but also that the Lord is continuing to spread the gospel in our world, that he is setting things up. We may not always see it, but he desires people to come to faith in him, and he is working to make that happen.